Welcome to this second lesson on the era of nation-states in Europe. Today, we journey through the tumultuous foundations of the Age of Revolutions, beginning with none other than the French Revolution of 1789. But before diving into those world-shaking events, let's take a closer look at absolutism, the political system that dominated Europe, and its intellectual counterpart, the Enlightenment. Could there be a more dramatic backdrop to revolutionary upheaval than monarchs claiming divine authority, supported by philosophers who envisioned unyielding royal power? Absolutism wasn't born in a day. Its roots stretch back to the 16th century with early inklings under Philip II of Spain. But where did this political juggernaut truly take hold? France. Here, absolutism blossomed into a full-fledged system that curtailed noble power and placed the king at the helm of unchallenged authority. The nobility, once dominant, saw their influence dwindle as monarchs claimed the mantle of divine right, sweeping aside centuries of feudal checks and balances. France's Louis XIV, reigning from 1661 to 1715, personified absolutism so thoroughly that he earned the title the Sun King, and his motto, "I am the state." Think about it, an entire country ruled by the will of one man. Louis didn't see his subjects as citizens, but as loyal servants of the crown. He enacted laws, levied taxes, waged wars, and administered justice with unchecked authority. For Louis, centralized power wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity, achieved through a strategy of unification, control, and relentless centralization. What fueled the absolutist mindset? Enter thinkers like Jean Bodin and Thomas Hobbes, who laid its intellectual groundwork. Hobbes' Leviathan from 1651 depicted a world where a strong centralized ruler was essential to avoid chaos. Absolutism, according to these theorists, wasn't just pragmatic, it was divinely ordained. Monarchs ruled by the will of God, a belief encapsulated in the phrase "king by the grace of God." Jacques Bossuet, another absolutist champion, articulated this vision in the words, "One king, one faith, one law." Under this framework, no one, neither church nor populace, had the authority to challenge the monarch, who acted as God's earthly representative. France wasn't just the birthplace of absolutism, it became its template. Beginning in the 16th century, wars strengthened royal authority, culminating in the leadership of Cardinal Richelieu. As chief minister to Louis XIII, Richelieu relentlessly undermined the nobility and centralized power in the crown's hands. By the time Louis XIV ascended in 1643, the groundwork for absolutism was firmly laid. When Louis XIV came of age and assumed full control in 1661, he needed no guiding hand. Instead, he assembled a state council and surrounded himself with capable ministers. But make no mistake, the ultimate decisions were his alone. Law enforcement, secret police, and political detentions became tools of royal authority, symbolized by the infamous Bastille prison. Under Louis XIV, France's military and administration underwent significant reform. His war minister, François-Michel Letellier, transformed the army into the largest standing force in the world, equipped with new technologies like bayonets, and divided into specialized units of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The French army became the terror and envy of Europe, led by skilled commanders like Turenne and Condé. On the economic front, Jean-Baptiste Colbert introduced mercantilism, or Colbertism, as it was known in France. His strategies aimed to bolster the royal treasury through efficient budget planning, state monopolies, and an emphasis on export-driven trade. Roads and canals were built, customs duties were restructured, and a robust financial system supported the crown's extravagant spending on the military and Versailles. Absolutism wasn't just about wielding power, it was about showcasing it. Nowhere was this more evident than at the Palace of Versailles, the ultimate symbol of Louis XIV's reign. Built in the 1670s and 1680s, this architectural marvel dazzled with luxurious interiors by Charles Lebrun and sprawling gardens designed by André Lenotre. The palace wasn't merely a residence, it was a stage for royal grandeur, designed to inspire awe and submission. Versailles also set the tone for European courts. Monarchs from Denmark to Russia tried to emulate its splendor, and French language, fashion, and customs became the gold standard of aristocratic life. Even Copenhagen's Frederiksstaden neighborhood built in the mid-18th century, echoed this French influence, centered around Amalienborg Palace and its magnificent equestrian statue of Frederick V. Louis XIV's absolutism left an indelible mark on Europe, inspiring monarchs and reshaping governance. Yet, even as absolutism reached its zenith, cracks were forming. The economic strain, coupled with the rising aspirations of the bourgeoisie and the plight of the peasantry, sowed the seeds of discontent. Could this tension, born in the opulence of Versailles, eventually lead to revolution? What happens when a system of absolute rule stirs the minds of its people? Enter the Enlightenment, a period spanning from the late 17th to the late 18th century, where philosophers and scientists reshaped how society viewed itself. Why is it called the Enlightenment? Because thinkers of the time believed that through reason, humanity could illuminate every corner of existence and uncover all truths. Bold claim, isn't it? But this intellectual revolution was built on the shoulders of scientific giants, reaching back even before its time. One of these early pioneers was the Polish cleric Nicholas Copernicus. In 1543, his groundbreaking work De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium suggested that the Earth orbited the Sun, not the other way around. A shocking notion, but was he a scientist in the modern sense? Not quite. His ideas were more rooted in Renaissance humanism, presenting a vision rather than scientific proof. But then came Tycho Brahe, the meticulous Danish astronomer whose precise observations laid the foundation for the work of Johannes Kepler. Kepler shattered the ancient geocentric view by proving that planets moved in elliptical orbits, not perfect circles and at varying speeds. Can you imagine the upheaval this caused to centuries of cosmological dogma? And yet, the most dramatic moment belonged to Galileo Galilei. He championed the Copernican system only to be condemned as a heretic. Forced to recant, his work nonetheless inspired Isaac Newton, who finally provided the physical laws explaining this heliocentric model. But here's the catch. These scientific revelations didn't just disrupt astronomy, they collided head-on with religion, and by extension, the absolute monarchies that leaned on religious authority. How could the idea of divine rule coexist with a universe governed by immutable natural laws? While scientists were busy challenging the heavens, Enlightenment philosophers turned their gaze to Earth. They dared to ask, who should hold power and why? In France, thinkers like Pierre Bayle argued for the freedom of science and belief. Bayle's revolutionary stance? That any dogma, even Christian teachings, should bow to the court of natural reason. His ideas marked a seismic shift in European thought. Meanwhile, in England, John Locke took a groundbreaking step in political philosophy. Locke proposed that all humans are born free, equal, and independent. But can a society of free individuals thrive without structure? Locke thought not. Thus, he introduced the idea of the social contract. Individuals surrender some freedoms to create a community that serves the greater good, or commonwealth. But who decides what's best? According to Locke, the people do, through their representatives with legislative and executive powers balanced to prevent tyranny. Building on Locke's framework, Montesquieu took it further with his concept of the separation of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial branches, each independent yet in balance. Why was this crucial? To prevent the concentration and abuse of power? Does this sound familiar? Montesquieu's ideas laid the groundwork for modern democracies. At its core, the Enlightenment was a rebellion against authority, particularly the Church. How could a movement championing reason coexist with institutions founded on faith? It couldn't. The Protestant Reformation had already weakened the Church's grip, and Enlightenment thinkers seized on this opportunity. The Church viewed these philosophers as a threat, and rightly so. They sought to expose truths the Church sought to suppress. The monumental encyclopedia, led by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, exemplified this. With 17 volumes published between 1751 and 1765, it cataloged human knowledge, defying censorship and earning outright condemnation from the Church. The Enlightenment didn't stop at science and politics. It ventured into economics, rejecting the rigid mercantilist systems of the time. Leading this charge was Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher often called the father of modern economics. In his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, Smith championed the free market. He argued that governments should avoid meddling in production and trade. Let businesses set their prices, he said, and prosperity will follow. Even his opposition to slavery stemmed not from ethics but from pragmatism. He believed paid workers were simply more productive than enslaved labor. Strangely enough, some of Europe's absolute rulers embraced Enlightenment ideas. Why? Did they truly care about liberty and progress, or was it just political convenience? Enlightened despotism saw monarchs like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia introducing reforms in education, law, and religion. Yet these reforms were often half-hearted, designed to strengthen their rule rather than empower their people. Curiously, while nations like Prussia and Austria implemented changes, France, the cradle of the Enlightenment, resisted, clinging stubbornly to its absolutist traditions. What happens when absolute monarchs decide to embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment? Do they truly seek to uplift their nations, or are they simply wielding reform as a tool for control? In the era of enlightened absolutism, kings and queens across Europe embarked on a journey of modernization, but their approaches and successes varied dramatically. Let's dive into this fascinating mix of idealism and pragmatism, starting with one of the most iconic figures, Frederick the Great of Prussia. Unlike Louis XIV, who famously declared, "I am the state," Frederick II of Prussia, better known as Frederick the Great, took a dramatically different stance. He called himself the first servant of the state, a revolutionary idea that emphasized serving the people over personal grandeur. But was it genuine, or just a clever rebranding of absolutism? After all, Frederick still ruled with an iron grip, just as Louis had. Yet his reign from 1740 to 1786 saw significant reforms that set him apart. Frederick began by building on his father's mercantilist reforms, establishing state monopolies, constructing roads and canals, and modernizing agriculture. Imagine this. Potatoes, now a staple of German cuisine, owe their spread to his agricultural initiatives. Through crop rotation and efficient farming methods, he boosted productivity across Prussia. Frederick's most groundbreaking reforms, however, were in justice and religious tolerance. A devout Calvinist ruling a Protestant nation, he extended religious freedom to Catholics and Jews, allowing them to work and run businesses freely. This was almost unthinkable in an age where religion often dictated one's rights. In law, his collaboration with jurist Samuel von Kochegi led to the abolition of torture, the establishment of judicial independence, and the principle of equality before the law. Does this sound like the seeds of a modern legal system? It was a remarkable transformation from a police state to a rule of law state. Meanwhile, in Habsburg, Austria, Maria Theresa took inspiration from Prussia's progress. Reigning from 1740 to 1780, she implemented sweeping reforms that reshaped her empire. Unlike Frederick, she had no qualms about taxing the privileged classes. Imagine the shock when nobles and clergy found themselves subject to the same taxes as commoners. This was a bold move, especially in a society where feudal hierarchies were deeply entrenched. Maria Theresa also championed education, establishing public schools, vocational training centers, and academies. Under her reign, Austria developed a unified criminal code and took its first steps toward abolishing serfdom. Though this landmark reform wouldn't fully materialize until 1781 under her son and co-regent Joseph II. Joseph continued her legacy by issuing a tolerance edict, establishing hospitals and orphanages, and even founding mental health institutions. Was this genuine altruism or calculated state building? Perhaps a bit of both. Over in Russia, Catherine the Great sought to bring Enlightenment ideals to her vast, sprawling empire. She read the works of the great philosophers and engaged in correspondence with thinkers like Voltaire. But did her admiration translate into action? Not quite. Despite her intentions, significant reforms were elusive. Why? Perhaps the sheer scale and complexity of Russia, or the entrenched power of the nobility, proved too great an obstacle. The Enlightenment's influence spread beyond the big players. In Portugal, reforms modernized schools, finances, and the military. In Denmark, Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician, initiated progressive changes, though his tenure ended in scandal and execution. After Struensee's fall, Andreas Peter Bernstorff continued some reforms, including the 1788 abolition of serfdom's harsh restrictions. Nowhere was the tension between Enlightenment ideals and absolutist governance more pronounced than in France. While monarchs in Prussia and Austria cautiously embraced reform, France resisted. Why? Decades of war and opulent court life under Louis XIV left the country drowning in debt. In a desperate attempt to stabilize the economy, John Locke, a Scottish economist, introduced the Banque Générale in 1715 and speculative ventures tied to colonial exploitation. The result? A financial disaster, with rampant inflation and a national bankruptcy in 1720. The following years brought fleeting stability under Cardinal Fleury, but after his death in 1743, France spiraled into economic collapse. Efforts to introduce financial reform were blocked by the privileged clergy and nobility. Can you imagine the frustration of a growing bourgeoisie, merchants, lawyers, and doctors, who watched helplessly as the outdated feudal system preserved aristocratic privileges? At the same time, population growth from the 1720s led to a food crisis. Inflation skyrocketed, hitting the poor hardest. Small farmers, already burdened by rising prices, faced crushing direct and indirect taxes. By the late 18th century, France's finances were in shambles. The royal court's insatiable spending created constant deficits, which were patched up with loans at exorbitant interest rates. Sounds unsustainable, doesn't it? It was. The monarchy faced an even bigger challenge. The privileged estates, the nobility and clergy, were largely exempt from direct taxation. The clergy contributed only voluntary payments, leaving the tax burden squarely on the shoulders of the poorest, primarily the peasants. Imagine this. Up to 70% of a peasant's income was consumed by taxes. Yet these impoverished communities could barely afford to pay anything, and the inefficient tax collection system only made matters worse. What could such a system achieve other than perpetuating a vicious cycle of poverty and debt? The financial chaos unfolded against a backdrop of deep societal divisions. On one side were the privileged upper classes, nobles clinging desperately to their feudal privileges, while paradoxically demanding limits on the monarchy's absolute power. On the other side, the bourgeoisie, the wealthier members of the Third Estate, called for greater equality and political representation. While the Third Estate officially included peasants, it was the rising bourgeoisie, made up of merchants, professionals, and intellectuals, who spearheaded demands for reform. Can you feel the tension brewing? A rigid social hierarchy, outdated feudal privileges, and an increasingly vocal middle class were a recipe for conflict. Efforts to reform France's financial system began under Louis XV, but gained momentum with Louis XVI, who ascended to the throne in 1774. The king's new finance minister, Robert Turgot, introduced reforms aimed at streamlining taxation and curbing royal expenses. But progress was slow, and resistance from the nobility was fierce. Then came the American War of Independence. In 1778, France entered an alliance with the American colonies against Britain, a move that drained its coffers even further. What did France gain in return? A modest peace agreement in 1783, restoring territories like Senegambia and Tobago, but the real prize, financial relief, remained elusive. Instead, the war compounded France's already dire debt crisis. One of the architects of France's wartime economy, Jacques Necker, attempted to conceal the growing deficit by borrowing even more. However, his decision to publicize the state's financial troubles in 1781 cost him his position. The revelation of a gaping budget hole further fueled public outrage. How could the government justify such extravagance while ordinary citizens struggled to put bread on the table? As the financial and social crises deepened, the seeds of revolution began to sprout. France saw an explosion of public discourse in salons, cafes, and political clubs. Here, the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers ignited the imaginations of liberals among the nobility, clergy, and bourgeoisie. Figures like Lafayette, Talleyrand, and Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès emerged as key voices of reform. The American Revolution in particular became a rallying cry. Its success against tyranny inspired many in France to question the legitimacy of their own oppressive system. Could a similar transformation take place here? Desperate for a solution, the Crown attempted to reform the tax system, even seeking contributions from the privileged First and Second Estates. But the nobility and clergy refused. The Parlement of Paris responded by forcing the king to summon the Estates General, a national assembly of representatives from all three estates. This marked the first time since 1614 that such a body had convened. Could this be the moment when France finally embraced meaningful reform? The timing couldn't have been worse. In 1781, poor harvests, livestock diseases, and rising food prices left the population desperate. British competition further undermined the economy. By year's end, the nation faced full-scale bankruptcy. Louis XVI had no choice but to reappoint Jacques Necker as finance minister, but the damage was done. Amid this chaos, elections for the Estates General took place in early 1789. A radical campaign ensued, with reformist ideas dominating the discourse. The most influential voice was Abbé Sieyès, whose pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, argued that the Third Estate was the true backbone of the nation and deserved full participation in governance. His call for representation struck a chord with a populace hungry for change. The Estates General convened in May 1789 at Versailles, but tensions immediately flared. The Third Estate demanded voting by head count rather than by estate, a move that would give them the majority. This challenge to tradition marked the beginning of a seismic shift in French politics and the countdown to revolution. The French Revolution didn't erupt overnight. It was the product of decades of financial mismanagement, social inequality, and a monarchy unable, or unwilling, to adapt to the changing times. The events of May 1789 signaled that the old order was crumbling, but no one could yet foresee the storm to come. What lay ahead was a period of upheaval, transformation, and bloodshed that would reshape not just France, but the entire world. And that is where we'll pick up in the next lesson. Thank you for now. See you next time.